His political mentor, the founder of the DUP, Ian Paisley, was in the top job for 37 years. Edwin Poots has thrown in the towel after just 34 days. After a day of drama, infighting and revolt, we ask if the largest party in unionism is damaged beyond repair. Welcome to The View. Tonight, Edwin Poots called it the greatest honour of his life, but this evening he's walked away from the top job after a bruising day at Stormont. After he'd forced through the nomination of Paul Givan as First Minister, Mr Poots felt the backlash of his party and is now contemplating life as a former party leader. We've gathered an expert panel together to discuss an extraordinary 24 hours in the life of the DUP. We'll ask if the party can survive this controversy and if we're now looking at the prospect of an early election. Hello. Just when you thought you'd seen it all, the DUP's fourth leader has lasted 34 days in the job. This time last night, Edwin Poots was negotiating with the NIO about the terms for nominating his protégé Paul Givan as First Minister. But his decision to push ahead with that today, against the clear wishes of most of his Assembly team, turned out to be a step too far. Tonight, he's tendered his resignation. Let's discuss today's dramatic events and what happens next with Professor John Tonge from the University of Liverpool, the newsletter's deputy editor Ben Lowry, Arlene Foster's former special advisor Emma Little-Pangeli, our political editor Enda McClafferty, and his opposite number at the Belfast Telegraph, Suzanne Breen. Welcome to all of you. Enda, first of all, did he have to go?
I think so, Mark. I think it became pretty clear today to Edwin Poots as the day progressed that he had no real option. As you say, it had been a bruising encounter for him, and his leadership was basically hanging by a thread since that pretty bad-tempered meeting this morning, whenever it was made clear to him that he no longer had the authority of the party's MLAs, the majority of them, the majority of the party's MPs, or indeed those in the Lords as well, because there was a great deal of anger in that meeting this morning at how Edwin Poots was conducting business, that there was no sense that he was going to consult with those about this decision to go ahead and nominate Paul Givan as First Minister. Instead, Edwin Poots got to his feet in the middle of that meeting, walked out past Sammy Wilson as he was talking, straight down the stairs into the chamber, and nominated Paul Givan as First Minister. And I think that, in a sense, that move alone perhaps sealed his fate. And I think when he turned up at that meeting of party officers tonight, he looked pretty bullish on the way in the door, but I think it quickly became apparent to him that there was no other option available to him. And I think there was no vote, as far as we understand, but there was a lot of hard conversation, and I think it was laid on the line pretty clearly to him that his time was up.
He promised whenever he took over the top job to unite and reform the party. He clearly didn't manage to do that. Is this the end of his political career, period?
Well, it's too early to say, Mark, I think, because while he has announced tonight that he's stepping down as DUP leader, he still is, of course, the Agriculture Minister on the executive, so we don't really know what his position is going to be there. We'll have to wait a day or two to see how that all plays out. But I think also, as well, Mark, the difficulty for Edwin Poots, of course, was the manner in which he had that smash and grab attempt at taking over the party from Arlene Foster. And I don't think he ever really recovered from that, the fallout from that. I think he had a strategy to take charge of the party, but he didn't really have a strategy beyond that in sense of how his leadership was going to work from there. And I think the wounds were so deep from that particular episode that Edwin Poots was never going to be the man to heal the wounds and unite the party. And I think that became pretty apparent to those people who backed him in the leadership contest and then who deserted him today whenever he went down the stairs and into that Assembly chamber, because there were some big names there. There was his deputy leader, Paula Bradley, for instance, was one of those who voted today on the wrong side, if like Edwin Poots was on the other. And also Michelle McIlveen, the Education Minister, was also one of those as well who voted against the DUP leader. So in a sense, when you see people like that peeling off, I think it was pretty clear that his time was up.
Yeah, and his chief whip and his deputy chief whip. So there were lots of very powerful people within the party, people who'd been put in those positions by him who voted against him today. I'll come back to you in a second, Enda. But Suzanne, Mr Poots came to power amid controversy. As we've said, he lasted, 34 days, just over 4 weeks. Was his leadership doomed to failure, in your view, from the start?
I think it was doomed to failure. There was neither style nor substance to it. His staunchest critics in the party said to me that they believed that he would be a short-term leader of the DUP. He would never match the Reverend Ian Paisley's 4 decades, Peter Robinson's 8 years, or even Arlene Foster's 5 years at the helm. But they thought that they would, in their words, be rid of him in May 2022. They thought he would have a disastrous Assembly election. I don't think even in their wildest dreams they would have imagined the chain of events that we saw today. It all goes back in many ways to the day that he was elected DUP leader and the lack of grace I think that he showed in failing to reach out to Sir Geoffrey Donaldson and give him a substantial mention in his acceptance speech. And from there we saw from parts of his team a swaggering machismo. We saw Ian Paisley elevated. That annoyed a lot of people in the party. And there was really nothing different policy-wise than Arlene Foster had offered. When he went into negotiations with Brandon Lewis, he just had Paul Given. In the past, DUP negotiating teams have included very seasoned negotiators, people like Nigel Dodds, and he didn't have anyone there. He didn't have a critical friend in those talks, and I think he completely and absolutely miscalculated.
John Tonge, thanks for joining us from Liverpool tonight. This night, 3 weeks ago, you will recall, we were reporting on how Mr Poots was ratified in dramatic circumstances at the Crown Plaza Hotel in South Belfast. Tonight, he's gone. What, in your view, went wrong?
Well, it was a colossal mistake choosing Edwin Poots. You don't like to kick a man when he's down, but let's look at, the political incompetence that has unravelled in the last 24 hours. Edwin Poots had to nominate a new First Minister. He knew what the price would be from Sinn Féin in terms of nominating Michelle O'Neill as Deputy First Minister again. That price would be Irish language provision. It was hardly a complex line of duty style plot. We knew what was coming from Sinn Féin. They simply wanted New Decade, New Approach to be implemented. So he should have been prepared for that, squared his party off in preparation for that, knowing that Sinn Féin was going to smell blood because the DUP would be petrified about an election. The DUP has all its exits blocked because potentially an election would be catastrophic for the DUP, given Edwin Poots' ratings and given his own party's ratings. So he should have been prepared, but instead he thought that he could somehow do a deal with Sinn Féin, moan about it and talk about British government intervention, and Sinn Féin was holding him hostage, as it were. But anyone could see that that was coming. It shouldn't be a surprise, and that's why he's ended up where he is now, by not taking his party with him. And those Assembly members who supported him only a few weeks ago deserted him in droves today. His position was simply untenable. It was unsurvivable from early this morning, really.
John, if this was about a return to core Paisleyite values for the DUP, where does tonight's development leave that wing of the party, do you think?
In tatters, because the most likely next leader is Geoffrey Donaldson. The only possible other contender is Sammy Wilson, and I don't think he will stand, but that's just possible that he might. Geoffrey Donaldson, having coming runner-up in a two-horse race, will probably end up as leader now. I mean, there is that problem then of what Geoffrey Donaldson does about having a First Minister in place who he doesn't really want in place in terms of Paul Given. But for the sake of the avoidance of an early election, it makes sense for Geoffrey Donaldson, assuming he is the next leader, to keep Paul Given there, even on sufferance, for so long as is necessary until he gets his own team in place. And that's the most likely denouement of what we've seen today. I think Geoffrey Donaldson will avoid the mistakes that Edwin Poots made, and Geoffrey Donaldson will try and involve all wings of the DUP and give them prominence, whereas Edwin Poots, virtually ignored those who had not supported him in the leadership contest.
Emma Little-Pangeli, until Monday of this week, you were, of course, part of Arlene Foster's inner circle in the First Minister's office. How disastrous have the past 24 hours been for the DUP?
Well, it hasn't been good for the DUP. I have represented this party. I've worked for this party for a very long time. I care very deeply about the party. So, of course, I, like many, many people, want to see this party succeed. And therefore, of course, what has happened over the last 24 hours, but even actually, quite frankly, what has happened over the last number of weeks and months has been very disappointing. And I think now is the time to try to bring the party together, to try to address some of those problems that have arisen. I think for Edwin Poots, he had a very difficult first couple of weeks of his leadership, and of course what has happened over the last 24 hours, last night and into today, seem to have been monumental mistakes which of course have had fatal outcomes for his leadership.
So it's down to mistakes that he made. He dropped the ball, in your view, did he?
Well, I think Edwin was clearly very, very keen to take the leadership. There are many in the party that were very unhappy about the way that that was done. In his own words, I think he said it was brutal, but he felt it was necessary. And I think it was really then over to him to demonstrate why he felt it was necessary. What were the changes that he felt needed to happen? And he had a very short window in order to demonstrate a change of direction and to address the issues that he felt needed to be addressed. However, over the course of the last 2 weeks, we haven't seen that. We haven't seen any significant change in policy, for example, on issues like North-South relations, in relation to the protocol, and of course then with what happened over the last 24 hours. But I think the major issue, I think, for him over yesterday and today was that in his leadership campaign, he made a huge deal around this issue of listening to people, talking to people, MLAs and MPs, to try to find a better way to make policy, to try to do that in a way which was better based on consensus. And, you know, clearly with what happened last night and today, that didn't happen. I think that's why you're seeing a significant amount of anger with some of the elected representatives. I think that's why we've ended up here today, because the first test of that, was he going to do things differently? And certainly, you know, throughout the campaign, clearly many of the elected representatives had concerns about the way that the DUP came to decisions. But Edwin was the person who stepped up and said he was going to address that. But there was no sign of that last night or this morning. And I think that's what's really pushed him towards this position tonight.
So in a nutshell, Emma, what you're saying is he had a very good plan to take power. That worked, but he had no plan whatsoever to lead. Clearly that didn't work.
Well, he clearly had a plan to take over the leadership, and as we understand it, that was a plan that was underway for some considerable time. This is a difficult night for him. I don't deny that in any way. Of course it must be difficult to be in this position after such a short period of time. But what appears to have been the case over the last 2 weeks is that he didn't have any actual plan or strategy for how he was going to address these issues, how he was actually going to implement that change, and what was he going to do. I think, as John has said there, about the very obvious situation that was going to arise when the First Minister stepped down, that resigned the Deputy First Minister, that of course would trigger a situation where he was handing Sinn Féin leverage in terms of what they wanted and perhaps a renegotiation. And unfortunately for Edwin tonight, the legacy of Edwin's leadership will be that the Secretary of State in the British government will underwrite the Irish language legislation and cultural package. That's going to happen. But that's really been the only outcome over the course of the last number of weeks, and that's the only outcome from the legacy of his leadership that I can see at this stage.
Can I just ask you, do you think his political career is now over? That's it?
Well, it's hard to say. You know, Edwin has been in the party and has been involved in politics for a very long time. I think it's important to say that he has many friends and supporters within the party, not just to the elected representatives, but of course right across, councillors and members of this party. But I do know that many of those people will have been dismayed by what happened last night and this morning. I think most people will say, well, hold on, why did this need to be done so quickly? Why couldn't this have been scheduled, for example, for Monday or Tuesday, if that was the intention, and take the time to talk to the MLAs, talk to the MPs, go out and talk to our DUP councillors and wider party membership and try to come to a consensus approach. And perhaps for Edwin Poots as leader to explain to people why he felt this needed to be done and why it needed to be done so quickly. Instead, he didn't do any of that. And as I've said, I think that was a mistake of monumental proportions, and that has led to very fatal outcomes for his leadership tonight.
OK, Ben Lowry, this is obviously disastrous for Edwin Poots personally, as Emma Little-Pangeli has just said. It's bad news for the DUP, obviously, as well. What about the impact the events of the past 24 hours are likely to have on unionism itself, do you think?
Oh, it's disastrous. But unionism has been in a disastrous place for quite a while. I mean, I agree with almost all of the analysis that has gone before. I think, for example, not praising, Edwin Poots not praising Jeffrey Donaldson or making a reference to him in his acceptance speech was a very serious blunder when he had just won narrowly. But let me just go off at a slightly different tangent that nobody's mentioned, and it's central to this. John Tonge was saying it was obvious he needed to square off the party. Emma Little-Pangeli is saying that, you know, maybe decide on Monday or Tuesday, talking about getting councillors. Well, maybe the DUP would have been brought round to this quite extraordinary and disgraceful plan to bring in Westminster, but unionism as a whole wouldn't have been. Think about the background to this, which hasn't even been mentioned tonight. Sinn Féin bring down Stormont, ostensibly over cash for ash, with the enduring red line. Some people foolishly thought that they were going to make same-sex relations and things like that a red line. The enduring, unwavering red line was an Irish Language Act. Hospitals and schools were left rudderless for 3 years, and it became both sides to blame. And they got their blackmail, they got their ransom, they paid, they got an Irish Language Act last year. Then we had a pandemic, and then the political party that boycotts Westminster, that's given special dispensation to boycott Westminster with allowances that nobody else is given, has the audacity, when there's a procedure to renominate First Ministers, and Deputy First Ministers would be the same if the Sinn Féin leader had stood down, to turn that into a new negotiation. And the DUP leader rolls over and says, seemingly we don't know exactly what happened, yes, and a Conservative and Unionist government that has done nothing ever at any point.
You know, Ben, with the greatest
once.
respect, you know there'll be people watching this who will say Sinn Féin was only asking for the delivery of something that was agreed 18 months ago. This wouldn't have become the problem it became if the DUP had lived up to the commitments it made in January of last year.
There's a whole other question about whether or not they should have done that. But you're right, that's what they did, and that means that Irish language legislation is coming. Otherwise, there won't be a Stormont. That is the case. However, we went into a pandemic. Everyone agrees that aside from the challenges on the health service of the pandemic, we have the worst waiting lists in the UK. We have multiple problems. We had multiple aspects to NDNA, and I come back to this. It's so unbelievable. It's so serious what's happened. Brandon Lewis was prepared to acquiesce in Sinn Féin, a party that is entitled to not want Northern Ireland to exist, but by goodness it's looking confident at the moment about the disintegration that it has helped to cause, the political disintegration. On top of all of this, instead of a Conservative and Unionist government saying, no, we're going to do the opposite, we are going to prioritise the other things to try to give some help to unionism at this time after the disaster and the betrayal of the Irish Sea border, it actually agrees to special treatment for Sinn Féin. And Edwin Poots seems to have agreed with that. The DUP has turned against him completely. But what is a new leader going to do? Is a new leader going to accept that
Ben,
premise?
the only thing about this is that I was speaking to the Secretary of State, Brandon Lewis, earlier, and obviously events have overtaken that interview and we're not able to run it on the programme tonight. But he was very clear. This was a deal that all of the parties signed up to in January of last year. And last night, and I asked him specifically about this, he was very clear that neither Paul Given nor Edwin Poots demurred from the deal that was on the table, and he didn't raise any issues about not being able to sell it to their backbenchers. There was a deal done last night, they signed up to it, and on the basis of that, they went to Stormont this morning and made their nominations for First Minister, and we are where we are. But the point is, everybody agreed to what was in that document last January.
Yes, you've just, by the way, summarised very well how something I don't recall ever seeing before, political leadership has combusted after 34 days because of what he did last night, which he didn't have the authority to do, and even his allies turned against him. But as I said, yes, it was agreed Irish language legislation last year, and there's serious questions about whether or not the DUP was able to deliver that within unionism. The feeling of resentment about all of the other factors would suggest that they weren't. But yes, the Irish language legislation is going to come if Stormont is going to survive, and that is something the DUP is going to have to live with because it agreed it.
OK. I'll come back to all of you in just a moment or two, but I just want to bring in our political correspondent, Gareth Gordon, who's been following the drama of the changes in the DUP leadership for the last 6 weeks. Let's see what he makes of tonight's developments. Gareth, we all remember the drama. You brought us from outside that South Belfast hotel on the night of Edwin Poots' ratification about 3 weeks ago or thereabouts. Does the drama of tonight top that?
In a way, it does. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that 3 weeks ago I thought Edwin Poots would be gone by this time. But everything he has touched in the intervening period has turned to you-know-what. I mean, today was a pretty bizarre day. From late last night at Stormont, when I saw that statement from Brandon Lewis saying that Edwin Poots had signed up to having the Irish language legislated from Westminster, I tweeted, I think at the time, the silence from the DUP is deafening. And it turns out that that actually was the case, because Edwin Poots had agreed to it, Paul Givan had agreed to it, but they hadn't told anybody else in the DUP. And when we turned up at Stormont this morning, we trained our cameras on the doors of the members' dining room. That is where that DUP meeting was happening. And I went down to the radio studio in Stormont, which you know well, to talk to Talkback. And I was amazed when Talkback began and I heard Edwin Poots in the chamber nominating. I didn't think that was going to happen. And just before I personally went on there, I got a phone call from a very senior DUP source to tell me the news. I almost fell off my chair that 24 people in that room had voted against nominating and only 4 for. If that person hadn't been the person that person was, I wouldn't have even used that line on the air, because quite frankly, to go against those sort of numbers, and it turns out now he left the room before the vote was actually taken, is just mind-boggling. You have to wonder what was going through Edwin Poots' mind.
Yeah, like most other people in the country, I was listening to Talkback today and I thought I could actually hear you falling off the chair when you were given that information. It was fairly remarkable stuff, a remarkable programme to be listening to as events unfolded live on the programme. What do you imagine Arlene Foster has been making of today's developments? You've said in the past you know her well. You have spoken to her and to some of those close to her a lot over the last number of weeks. She tweeted an interesting message this afternoon, didn't she?
Well, she was in Belfast, but she wasn't at Stormont. She was in a restaurant, a well-known restaurant in South Belfast. And I mean, she said, this says it all really, she said she was having lunch, great hospitality is open again. Hope everyone is having a great day this lovely sunny afternoon. The only thing missing from that was a smiley face. I mean, it's a human reaction. Obviously, she feels that she was very wronged. She has sat back. She's played a blinder ever since. She sang the Frank Sinatra song with a little bit of help from somebody in Enniskillen last week at that big British Irish Council meeting, and then she left the stage. And I think Arlene Foster's status has standing really has increased in the past few weeks since she was toppled in that pretty brutal way. And I don't think really Edwin Poots ever recovered from the manner of Arlene Foster's ousting. People simply didn't like it, and Arlene Foster has managed to ride above that. So it will be interesting now. Arlene Foster, I understand, is going to continue as an MLA until recess. I mean, what are the odds of Jeffrey Donaldson maybe offering to bring her back? I don't know if she would ever be interested in doing that, but it's one of those intriguing possibilities. I don't think it'll happen, I have to say, but you never know. I've stopped saying things won't happen. In the past few weeks, I've seen things I never thought I would see.
Yeah, I think you and most of the rest of us as well. Just a final one briefly, Gareth, if you would. What's your hunch on what happens next in the DUP's leadership game of pass the parcel?
Well, the party which was probably, along with Sinn Féin, certainly in our orbit, the most tightly controlled, most disciplined party, needs to become that again. I mean, as a journalist, I don't want that to happen. I suspect it will happen. Some people who've been answering their phones very liberally until tonight aren't answering their phones tonight. Maybe there's a very good reason for that. But I suspect Jeffrey Donaldson, sooner or later, sooner I would imagine, will get the leadership of the party. It doesn't mean it'll be easy, it has to be said, because don't forget the majority of that small electorate of 36 people didn't vote for Jeffrey Donaldson by a majority of 2. He lost, so he's got some wooing to do there. What does he do? Does he try and reach out? Does he keep Paul Givan in place? I simply don't know. But whoever takes that job, and I do think it will be Sir Jeffrey Donaldson, they've got a job of work to make the DUP electable again, it has to be said, because that Assembly election comes in May. It could come before that. The DUP, at the moment, you wouldn't put much money on them being the biggest party, that's for sure.
No, probably not. OK, Gareth, we'll leave it there. You've had a busy, well, like most of your colleagues, a very busy 24 hours and a very busy couple of weeks as well. So, look, thanks very much indeed for making time for us on the programme tonight. Let's go back to Gareth's colleague, Enda McLafferty, our political editor. And I just want to pick up, and I was going to say boss, but then I thought, you know, you don't be embarrassed if I referred to you as Gareth's boss. What about the point he raised there about the future for Paul Givan as First Minister? Do you think that he's going to be around in that job for much longer, realistically?
Well, I think there is every possibility, Mark, because we know Sir Geoffrey Donaldson's form is about reaching out, and he made that pretty clear whenever he was running to be a contender in the race and lost out eventually to Edwin Poots. And I think there's probably part of Geoffrey Donaldson who might see leaving Paul Givan in that position for whatever length of time might be the first step in that direction to try and heal some of those wounds within the party. He'll also be mindful as well, Mark, that to remove Paul Givan, to force him to tender his resignation, that then creates that instability once again, with Sinn Féin, of course, then having to renominate to the post of Deputy First Minister. And it's during that period, of course, that period of flux, that I think that cost Edwin Poots very dear in his position as leader. And I can't see Sir Geoffrey Donaldson repeating that, if you like, and going back down that road again. And let's not forget, it's not just Paul Givan, because we have other ministers as well who have been appointed by Edwin Poots. Paul Frew, for instance, in economy, and also Michelle McIlveen in education, and Gary Middleton as a junior minister. So they too, I'm sure, will be looking on quite nervously tonight to see what's going to happen to them in terms of their career. And then beyond that, of course, there are those people who signed up to Edwin Poots, liked his style of leadership, liked the direction that he was offering within the party, who might now also be having second thoughts about that particular strategy. People like Christopher Salford, for instance, Paula Bradley, other people as well who, I suppose, caught some by surprise whenever they said that they were going to be standing full square behind Edwin Poots.
Emma, much was made a few weeks ago of the fact that this was the first leadership election in the history of the DUP, a party that is, of course, 50 years old. There might be those who regret that departure from tradition within the party and might think that the best thing to do would be to avoid an election this time round. Do you think Geoffrey Donaldson is looking at coronation to take over from Edwin Poots, or will there be a contest? Might Sammy Wilson throw his hat into the ring, do you think?
I'm not sure is the honest answer. I suspect that Sir Geoffrey Donaldson is probably the most likely candidate to put his name forward. What I don't know would be if there's other people who might be interested in that. I do suspect, though, that the party will want stability as quickly as possible. I therefore I think that what is likely to happen is that the process is probably going to be a shorter one than what we've seen before. I do think the party as well, they've looked at what happened in terms of that leadership campaign. There were elements of that, clear elements of that they didn't like, and many people, certainly the DUP has been a party that has always done its business behind closed doors. I suspect that will continue to be the case in the main, and certainly that some of the issues that we've seen fraying at the edges will be addressed as well. But I think the most important thing, if it is Sir Geoffrey or whoever the new leader is, the key thing for that person to do will be to reach out, to try to mend fences, to bring people together, to unify the party, and certainly perhaps a good starting point would be for that leader to reach out to some of those councillors or others that have left as well. But also, I don't believe that a new leader coming in should adopt a bridge-burning approach to those that were surrounded themselves in terms of Poots, Edwin Poots, and that leadership team. So look, I do think that what the party needs is a leader that is going to come in and reach out to all aspects of the party, bring the party back together, and to move forward in a very positive way.
That might be very difficult, though, Emma. If I told you that someone very close to Edwin Poots, a very senior member of the DUP, told this programme tonight that the push to get rid of Mr Poots has been orchestrated by those opposed to his leadership for the past 3 weeks, and the damage to the party will be very hard to repair. What's your response to that? Well,
look, it's not my understanding. My understanding is that there was widespread unhappiness in terms of what happened last night and this morning. But I also think, look, there are big issues at play here. No matter who the new leader is, when they come in, the Secretary of State, as I've indicated, he's already said that he's going to underwrite this legislation. I think the problem with that, and just to pick up on something that Ben said earlier, it's not just about the process of managing the party towards agreeing what perhaps Edwin Poots wanted to happen. I think this was much more about allowing the party to have a proper discussion about what is the right way forward. I think the big issue here is that for many people across Northern Ireland, many unionists across Northern Ireland, they have seen their unionist representatives and politicians asking repeatedly for the British government, the UK government, to move in relation to big issues such as the protocol and Article 16. There's been a reluctance to do that by the UK government. They've been very slow to do that. They haven't yet done that, and yet they have moved very quickly this week in relation to the cultural package in Irish language. And I think that's a big problem for the DUP and the representatives going forward, and a big problem, I think, for the Secretary of State. OK, Emma, until 4 days ago, you were a senior special advisor within the DUP. You're now trying your hand at political punditry, and it's very good to have you on the programme, and thank you for joining us tonight. But do you fancy your hand again in electoral politics in a DUP led by Jeffrey Donaldson in the near future? Well, I could say what a night to pick to try to make my commentating debut in terms of the View. So much going on today. But certainly, look, you know, I've always made clear throughout all of this that I remain a member of the party. I'm a supporter of the Democratic Unionist Party. But certainly for me, I made the decision to step back from those particular roles and to pursue some other interests in the next while. OK, well, you lost your seat, of course. That's why you stepped back. Well, from also having a role with the party is what I meant, yes, of course. Yeah. OK, well, you're not ruling it out, so that's interesting. We'll get others to comment on that as well. Emma, thank you. Just coming back to you, Suzanne, is Jeffrey Donaldson a shoe-in as the next leader, do you think?
I think he is. I mean, his own polling in advance of the leadership contest showed that he was regarded as head and shoulders above Edwin Poots as DUP leader. He was popular as well with Alliance voters, with Ulster Unionist voters. That's really important for transfers in an Assembly election. And the Lucid Talk poll for the Belfast Telegraph showed exactly the same. I think the DUP had a punt on Poots, and now it's time for steady, safe, tried and trusted leadership, and Jeffrey Donaldson is perfect for that. His whole political demeanour as well, he's not confrontational, he's a bridge builder. Had he won the leadership, I think his ministerial team would have been very different to Edwin Poots, who only offered Gary Middleton, the only Donaldson supporter, got the junior ministry. So I think it has to be Sir Jeffrey Donaldson, and the DUP cannot afford a contest. Its party is ripped apart and it's far too bruised. This will be a coronation. What do you think, John Tonge, are the lessons that the senior members of the DUP need to have learned in the last number of weeks? This experiment, this Poots experiment, clearly hasn't worked. How do they make sure they don't repeat the mistakes of the last month?
Well, they need to think about electability. They chose the wrong leader. They chose the lesser person in terms of electability, and they need to think about policy, which wasn't discussed at all during the leadership contest, other than vague ways of opposing the protocol. But there was no airing of any sort of unionist vision. That's the way forward. I agree with Suzanne that Jeffrey Donaldson is, by far the likely winner here of any contest. I don't think there will be a contest. It will be a coronation. He's got to gently remove Poots's people who are in place now, whilst making sure that all wings of the party are happy. But if you don't want a particular first minister in place, then it's going to have to be gently done. And if Paul Given doesn't step aside, because he is joined at the hip essentially to Edwin Poots, then eventually Sir Jeffrey would have to move him aside. But it'll have to be done very, very delicately. You cannot risk, say, triggering that election. There's also the logistical problem of Sir Jeffrey being at Westminster, and he's going to have to look for a seat. And there's no such thing as a safe seat anymore for the DUP, given where it's polling at the moment. So there are logistical difficulties. And he is, of course, conscious of the fact that the majority of MLAs didn't support him when he stood for the leadership, which is something of an embarrassment. But that can be overcome. And what is a catastrophic day for the DUP, I suppose you can say that the party could now, from a very low base, come back on the up, because Sir Jeffrey Donaldson will have appeal to unionist voters across the spectrum. They've got the BT bounce to contend with, but when you look at what unionist voters think, they might take a punt on a DUP led by Sir Jeffrey Donaldson in a way that they wouldn't have contemplated it, a DUP led by Edwin Poots.
Ben, it is interesting to just contemplate that, the difficulty that whoever takes over from Edwin Poots faces, a kind of a pincer movement, if you like, from Doug Beattie on one flank and Jim Allister on the other. We've talked about that DUP squeeze that people have identified. We've talked about how the Alliance Party's been doing very well and actually won votes in the DUP in previous elections. You could understand individuals who might have been or might have thought they were interested in the leadership of the DUP in the recent past running a mile from the job this time round.
And this is one of the issues, and this is probably why Jeffrey Donaldson is a shoo-in, because nobody has really wanted the job. Very few people have wanted the job in recent years. So the funny thing is about Edwin Poots, it would have been a logical move had he been openly conservative Christian, had he been hardline and decided that the DUP is not going to be a catch-all party, that by being a catch-all party of having liberals and fundamentalists, it's one of the reasons it sort of had a lot of difficulties. And then you have Doug Beattie as a liberal unionist. So you have two. That would have been a challenge to Jim Allister. The problem is that Edwin Poots wasn't hardline. He didn't go down that route. So there was a complete confusion there. Now, if Jeffrey Donaldson becomes the leader, as we all expect he will, he's not that different from Doug Beattie. So you get into another interesting area. Will Doug Beattie and Jeffrey Donaldson be able to work together very well? Or will they be too similar? And will that boost Jim Allister?
And I wanted to ask you about what you think the implications of all of this are for power sharing. I understand that Paul Givan has indicated he won't be attending the North-South Ministerial Council meeting in Armagh tomorrow. Certainly RTE was reporting that just before I came down to the studio earlier this evening. Is it a surprise to hear that he's not going to that? And what are the potential implications on the relationship between the DUP and Sinn Féin, do you think?
Well, there are question marks, first of all, Mark, if that event is going to go ahead tomorrow. I think there was some concern raised about that late this evening. So we're not quite sure if the event is actually happening tomorrow, never mind Paul Givan going along to take part. But I think the whole area of power sharing, it's an interesting question when you look at Edwin Poots, because there are some out there who believe that Edwin Poots might have been good for power sharing, but bad for the DUP, because we know, for instance, that he is well received within Sinn Féin. He's got a good relationship with Conor Murphy. It'll be helped, in fact, by what happened over the course of the past few days around the Irish language legislation. We also know that he went down quite well in Dublin whenever he went across the door to meet Micheál Martin on their first meeting and declared that he was going to be leading his delegation to the next North-South Ministerial meeting. So you can see how Edwin Poots was starting to be that pragmatic politician that we heard about in the past and was starting to reach out in all directions. The big problem for him, of course, is that he wasn't looking over his shoulder and reaching back to his colleagues within the party to bring them along with him.
Just been told in my ear that it's been confirmed and that North-South Ministerial Council meeting is not happening in Armagh tomorrow. So that's been called off. That's an interesting development. Suzanne, we've got about a minute left. I just wanted to ask you about the prospect of an election and the fact that Jeffrey Donaldson, if he takes over as leader, is of course a Westminster MP and would need to get himself back to Stormont to have a real power base in Northern Ireland politics.
Well, he signalled during the leadership contest that he was willing to come back. A natural place might have been to put him into North Down to replace Gordon Dunn, but that position has already been filled this week with Gordon Dunn's son Stephen being put in by Edwin Poots. So the strange thing is that Jeffrey Donaldson could actually end up being more hardline in certain issues with Sinn Féin than Edwin Poots was.
OK. Thanks very much indeed, Suzanne. That's just about it from all of us in the programme. If you think 34 days is a short time to be a political leader, spare a thought for the Mexican president back in 1913 who served a term of office that lasted 45 minutes. I'm back at the weekend with Sunday Politics at the usual time of 10 o'clock on BBC One. Who knows where we'll be by then? And as the old saying goes, 34 days is a long time in politics. But then again, that's life. From all of us, good night.
That's life. That's what the people say. You're riding high in April, shot down in May. I know I've got to change my tune. When I get back up on top in June, that's life. Funny as it may seem. Some people get their kicks from stepping on a dream. I don't let it get me.